What's up, fam? I'm glad you're with us this week as we continue our series in the book of Exodus called Delivered. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 14, and while you're turning there, I want to ask you a question. Would you be freaked out, or would you think this is fun? Imagine a friend of yours shows up at your house in a car. They put a blindfold on you, they put earplugs in your ears, and they say, I'm taking you on a joyride. You have no idea where you're going, what you're going to do, how long you're going to be gone, or what you will eat along the way. Now, some of us, we are wired for that kind of adventure and trust. And some of us, we're just way too skeptical, and we don't like to live in that kind of uncertainty. Well, that's where we find ourselves as we recap the book of Exodus tonight. You see, Israel has been in Egypt for 430 years, most of those as slaves. And in order for them to get out, God has caused these plagues to come on to Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. So they are now leaving Egyptian slavery, and the text says they're leaving with all the riches of Egypt. I mean, they aren't leaving empty-handed because they are set up to become free. They are set up to follow God, to become a great nation of influence for God. That's why God always called the children of Israel his people. Now, why would they ever be tempted to go back? And the answer is because the people of Israel did not know how to be free. I mean, they didn't even know if a better place or a better life even existed or was possible for them. So I hope you will hear and see God in these stories from Exodus. But my biggest desire is that you will hear what God is wanting to deliver you from now and in the days ahead. Now, I always saw myself as a good kid growing up. I went to church a lot. I could notice sin. I could avoid sin. And I really wanted to trust God in every area of my life. But it was hard. And I made some mistakes along the way. I entered into bad relationships, got out of those, and chose to go back to those bad relationships because I wanted to be loved and accepted. You see, I would go places or I would say things that even now I look back on and wish I hadn't done. And it was all because I wanted to be loved and included. You see, every day I have to make the decision to go forward, not back, in what I watch, in what I think, and what I pursue. You see, moving forward means looking for God's presence instead of your problems. So I want you to write down next to Exodus chapter 14 these three words: presence over problems. Presence over problems. Now, what kind of problems did the children of Israel face as they were going into a life of freedom? Well, we're going to dive into that tonight. And the first one was direction and protection. You see, God's people are leaving Egypt and they are following God by following this pillar of cloud, which I imagine is a vertical cloud, which is different than just your regular horizontal clouds during the day, and a pillar of fire at night. See, this was God showing his presence and his direction. They weren't wandering, they were following. But of course, Pharaoh changed his mind like he had in the past, and he sends his best chariots and his biggest troops after them. And so the children of Israel come up to the Red Sea, they have that in front of them, and they turn around and they look at the approaching problem behind them, the Egyptian army and their mighty chariots. And so that's where we'll join the story in chapter 14, verse 11. They said, "What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. For it's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch." Man, you see, when you focus on your problems, you want to go back to how things used to be. But focusing on God's presence will help you understand that God protects. Down in verse 20, here's what he did. So the cloud settled between the Egyptian and the Israelite camps. And as darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and the Israelites did not approach each other all night. You see, God provided a wall of protection. And while that wall was up the next morning, it says that God parted the Red Sea. His people went across the Red Sea on dry ground. The Egyptian army chased in after them, and then the walls of water collapsed on them, drowning them. You see, God provided direction, and then he also provided protection. So now over in chapter 15, I want us to focus on the second problem. And the second problem was water. In verse 22, I want you to write presence over problems. You see, after the Red Sea, they traveled for 3 days. They didn't have any water. They found a spring, but when they got to this spring, it was bitter water, the text says. So their celebration, it turned into frustration. They questioned and complained, and once again, they wanted to go back. You see, just 3 days ago, God provided possibly one of the biggest miracles in the history of miracles at the Red Sea when there was too much water. And now that they're tired and a little thirsty, they start questioning because they're focusing on their problem. But once again, God provides. He turns the bitter water fresh by having Moses pick up a piece of wood, throw it into the oasis, and it turns it fresh. Now, some scholars say that this miracle is a foreshadowing of Jesus dying on a wooden cross, turning the bitterness of our sin into his fresh, life-giving presence. You see, not only does God provide in the immediate, but he also leads them to something better. Look with me at 15 verse 27, where it says, after leaving Marah, the Israelites traveled on to the oasis of Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there beside the water. Let me ask you tonight, what are you consuming that's making you bitter instead of seeing God's presence? See, God is always giving us the right direction. The third thing I want you to write tonight is I want you to write again, presence over problems in chapter 16. Because the third problem was food. See, now God has moved his people from the 12 springs to the base of Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is famous in Old Testament history because it is a holy place. It's a sacred place. It's the first place that God spoke to Moses through the burning bush. And even throughout years later, God would speak to his leaders there on Mount Sinai. So in Exodus chapter 16, verse 2, the whole community is camped there, and here's what happens. There too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If you had only killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into the wilderness to starve us all to death. Here we go again. You get a little hungry, you get a little hangry, and things get bad, and we want to go back. But once again, God provides. Look down in verse 13 with me. That evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp. The next morning, the area around the camp was wet with dew, and when the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. What is it, they asked each other. They had no idea. And Moses told them, it is the food the Lord has given you to eat. I mean, how many miracles must you and I and the children of Israel see before we remember and realize that God is present, that he's protecting, and he's directing at every moment? Do you know what humans' most basic needs are? Shelter, water, and food. You see, God not only provides these, but he also gives direction by being present. You see, God has created you with the ability to go forward, not backward. Science has proven that we are wired to take the easiest way out. It's like when you're doing a workout and you're supposed to do 4 sets and you finish the 3rd set and you think, I've done enough. Or you're studying for a test and you're like, I could study for another hour or I could go play some video games. You go, I've studied enough. Yeah, we are wired to take the easiest way out. And you know what? These are special pathways in our brain called neural pathways. These connections can be formed with every decision you make. See, when you make a decision that is pleasurable to you, there's a stimulus in your brain that releases a chemical called dopamine. That's where we get the word dope from. But sometimes these behavior patterns are harmful. And they're so tempting because we want to feel good even for just a moment. You see, God created you with the ability to form new neural pathways that can also be rewarding, but they take practice and you must resist going back to what you've always done. And isn't that the life of what following God is about? Jesus provides a way, and God's Spirit is the presence that we need to go forward, not back. Hey fam, what problem is keeping you from trusting God's presence? Do you need community for your insecurity? Do you need a group leader who can guide you through some of the things that are confusing in your life right now? Do you need comfort and guidance for your parents' divorce? Do you need help with your mental health? Do you need a friend to encourage you to stop going back to some of your destructive behaviors? Write this down as we wrap up. God never fails when you are moving forward. He never fails. Now, will you see obstacles as you move forward? And will you have your fail moments? Of course we will. Yes, there's value in learning from our past. But this week, remember, it's never good to go back to the things that God has delivered you from or is delivering you from. Because if you are going to be delivered, it's only going to be by a power that's greater than you. Jesus calls every follower to move forward and never go back to their old life. He did this with his disciples in the New Testament, and he does it all the way with us today. Let's focus on his presence, and we won't go back.
What's up, fam? Thank you so much for joining us again for an amazing message. Us in the room, we were blessed by it, and we pray that you felt and encountered God from wherever you were watching from. In the description below, we have some questions and some scriptures that we want you to dig into as a follow-up to this lesson. Y'all, we are all on the journey of being delivered. So no matter where you are, if you are further along or just getting started, this series is for all of us. And so go ahead and dig in to the content that's in the description. Maybe call a friend and engage with a friend. Make sure that you follow us on Instagram. Make sure that if you have any questions, you write it down in the comments below. We love you so much, and we'll see you next week. Peace.